This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. My name is Andy Steele, and I am the host. Tonight, we'll be joined by members of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. They just filed a grand jury petition this week. Big news in the 9/11 Truth Movement. We're bringing it to you here on 9/11 Freefall. We'll be talking more about that in the upcoming interview. It's a long one, so I am not going to delay. The interview is coming to you right now.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
All right, I am joined this week by three great guests who are taking steps to make something happen, bring justice for the victims and their families of this terrible event that we talk about every week, 9/11, the evidence that the buildings were brought down in controlled demolitions on that day. They're very aware of it. They're going to make sure that more people are aware of it. And most importantly, the people in our justice system who should be doing something about it, should have been doing something about it for the last 17 years. Well, we're going to bring some action now. My three guests are Mick Harrison, Julio Gomez, David Meiswinkle. They are from the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. They're going to be telling you what that is and what this group has been up to, particularly this week. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But first I want to say, guys, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
I wanted everybody to know you guys individually, where you're coming from, your backgrounds, particularly your professional backgrounds. So starting with Mick, briefly tell our audience about yourself and also how you got into the 9/11 issue.
Well, I'm a public interest lawyer, 25 years experience. Before that, I taught mathematics, and I've been working mostly on whistleblower protection cases, environmental protection, government accountability and oversight issues for the last 25 years. And I got involved with 9/11 by accident, I guess you would say. I live in Bloomington, Indiana, and I walked into a meeting one day a few years after 9/11, heard some folks talking about bombs being placed in buildings. And I said, what in the heck are you talking about? And they were talking about the early investigation by Professor David Ray Griffin, who had made one of his first public statements about the evidence indicating explosives were used at the World Trade Center on 9/11. This was a total shock to me. And to be honest, I didn't actually believe it when I first heard it. So I said, well, why do you think this? And they said, well, he's done a lot of research, but we have someone here in Bloomington you might want to talk to find out more about this, and that's chemist Kevin Ryan. And Kevin Ryan is a whistleblower, used to work at Underwriter Laboratories, and he's a 9/11 whistleblower. He actually lost his employment there simply because he raised concerns about what happened with the building destructions. And the reason he raised it there was Underwriters Laboratories, some folks don't know this, was the company that certified the steel used in the World Trade Center construction. And Kevin knows that, the temperature at which steel melts, which is much higher than jet fuel burns. And so he was asking his supervisors and ultimately to the top of the company, did we do something wrong in certifying the steel? And ultimately, he got an answer. It took him a while, but he got an answer. The answer was no. The steel was good. We certified it correctly. But, he still got fired. So I went and talked to Kevin and actually represented him for a time But Kevin educated me on the details of the chemistry and the science related to the World Trade Center building collapses. And we had David Ray Griffin come to Bloomington and speak. So that's the short version of how I got started. At that point, I started doing what I do as a lawyer, which is, following the evidence. And I've been doing that ever since, which leads us to, what we're doing with the petition.
And here we are today. It's funny you talking about how you couldn't believe it at the very beginning. I remember that feeling, just how when you first hear the notion that there were explosives placed in the World Trade Center towers on September 11th, the idea seems so out of bounds. And now here I am, so many years after the event, after having done so much research, that the official story is so out of bounds scientifically, when matched up with the facts, with common sense, that, it's funny how you go through that transition just through a little bit of research. And really that's all people have to do is look at the evidence for themselves and use their own common sense, use their own discernment. And I really believe that would lead them to signing the petition at AE 9/11 Truth, signing your petition there at the Lawyers Committee group, and being part of this movement. David, I know you've been on the show before, but remind our audience about yourself and your background and how you got into 9/11.
Sure, Andy. Thank you. I'm a criminal defense attorney mostly at this time, but I'm a retired police officer, 23 years. And I first, something was very peculiar when I was observing how the 9/11 was initially handled, and that was how the crime scene wasn't respected. The forensic evidence it wasn't analyzed. The inspectors or the investigators weren't given access to the iron and steel and things of that nature, which could be determinative of the causes of the event. In other words, it was seen to be preordained. And as a police officer, you're taught to protect the crime scene. That's your most important thing. So that sort of alerted me initially, and there were some books that came out at that time. I think Thierry Masson came with a French. She was a French writer, but my background was before that. I had studied a number of things. I mean, going back to the Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King. So I had a suspicion sometimes of the official story. And as a police officer, I was in a department that was very corrupt. And at the time, I had to take stands, and I did, and I opposed a very powerful political machine at that time. So I knew that government, and I knew it from the inside, could be very corrupt. And I looked at where I was working as a microcosm of what existed on a far greater scale. Well, 2009, I ran as an independent for governor against Chris Christie, and I raised the issue about a new 9/11 investigation. I had never seen or heard about architects and engineers, and then someone turned me on to them, and I was fascinated by the science. It was refreshing because there was no politics involved. It was just, this is our scientific facts, this is natural law, this is the way things work, and the government story doesn't jive with the law, with the natural law. So I got involved there, and I started something in New Jersey called New Jersey 9/11 Aware. And I had met a young lady, Pamela Sensei, who was riding a bike across the country. So I met her down in Washington, and we presented to the FBI at that time important documents. One of them was a thermetic material discovered in the dust of 9/11 World Trade Center catastrophe, which is actually one of our exhibits. Pamela used that or brought that all the way across the country. And then we hooked up. We formed a radio show called Quantum Matrix Radio. And a few years ago, we walked 440 miles. We walked the entire crime scene from Shanksville down the Potomac River, the backwoods, camping and filming and talking to people, to the Pentagon. And then from the Pentagon, we walked up to Baltimore, Philadelphia, New Jersey, across the George Washington Bridge, down into Manhattan, and to the survivor tree at Ground Zero. We're doing a movie on that, and we've done the first part. The second part is being produced. So I have, sort of say, it doesn't surprise me that, unfortunately, this false flag and official story still stands. But right now we're trying to take that apart in the sense of presenting the truth to people through this grand jury petition, and it's very exciting that it's finally been condensed and put forth now, and that gentlemen like Mick Harrison and Julio Gomez are right on the front line and leading the charge.
That's right. A lot of great people out there doing a lot of good things, trying to get the word out, trying to do like what you guys are doing over at the Lawyers Committee by filing this grand jury petition that we'll be talking about, and something that you said, David, about finding corruption in places. I mean, if anybody wants to take up a cause and fight for justice, believe me, there's plenty of opportunities to do that in this country, in this world, nonetheless. And people do continue to believe the lie. I just saw an article the other day posted by someone who claimed to be debunking the 9/11 conspiracy theories, had all of his facts wrong, and there's nothing that drives me crazier than a debunker who can't even get their facts straight, claiming that the floor's pancaked on each other, doesn't even know the official story. So there's a lot of ignorance out there, and a lot of people who choose to be ignorant, particularly people in high places who we turn to for justice, accountability on this issue. Julio, same question. Tell us about your professional background and how you got into 9/11.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm actually a latecomer to the 9/11 truth movement. I've been practicing for 20 years in the area of complex commercial litigation and civil rights. At a law school, I was working for two commercial law firms, and then I went on my own and had a solo practice voted to small business representation and also civil rights work in the area of First Amendment, free speech, personal rights related to medical decisions, and also police brutality. And I came across the issue late. It was only about 3 years ago when I actually started to question the official story. And I think you're absolutely right. You begin to question it by doing your own research because the mainstream media simply does not give you the unanswered questions. And so I came across Richard Gage's Architects and Engineers website. I saw the work that he and his group had done. I saw the video that's narrated by Ed Asner, and I was floored. I don't have an engineering or architectural background. I just assumed that the government was telling me the truth. But when I saw experts talking about how there were unanswered questions with respect to the so-called quote-unquote collapse of the towers, and more precisely, the destruction of World Trade Center 7, I began to do even more research. And then as an attorney, I decided I needed to become involved, had an obligation to do something in my field of expertise, and that's when I connected with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. I eventually became a member of the board and started working with them. Fantastic group of very able, very experienced people who have good head on their shoulders and a heart in the right place. And I'm very proud to be a part of their team.
Well, and I'm sure they're very happy to have you too, all of you guys, and to be using your profession, to be using your talents for this issue and doing all the work that you do. I mean, you certainly deserve a hand. So I'm going to address this question at Mick, but David and Julio, if you have anything to add, also feel free to chime in. But tell our audience about the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. How did it start? And what do you guys do?
Well, we're a nonprofit. We're incorporated in Pennsylvania. Our mission is accountability and transparency regarding 9/11, the events leading to 9/11, and the events resulting from 9/11. We incorporated, I guess, now about 2 years ago. We existed in a sort of an informal form for a couple years prior to that. Jane Clark has been our chairperson for that entire time and has done a lot to organize the group and recruit volunteers. We're all volunteers at the moment. I'm serving as executive director, but still in a volunteer capacity. David and Julio are on our board of directors. We also have Ed Asner on our board of directors, attorney Mike Springman. We have David Cole, who's a well-known FOIA researcher, on our board of directors. It's been extremely helpful to us. And Tremblay Oakville Jacoby, who's done a lot for our outreach and public education, who's our vice chair for those purposes. So our goal is to help everyone understand what really happened, and then in the case of the petition we're now doing, as an example, we're trying to foster accountability for those who may have committed crimes or engaged in, for example, government misconduct.
All good, important work. So tell our audience what you guys set in motion this week.
Well, we did file a petition with the U.S. Attorney in New York. It is 52 pages long. It has 57 exhibits, including video, including testimony from firefighters, scientific reports and studies. And if anyone would like to see the entire filing, which we encourage, you can go to our website, which is lcfor911.org. That's lcfor911.org. You can read the petition online. There are active links to the exhibits, and you can read the exhibits online or view them, in the case of video, online. The idea behind our filing is that under federal law, the U.S. Attorney has an absolute obligation, as in a legal mandatory duty, to relay to a grand jury evidence of a federal crime that is reported to the U.S. Attorney by anyone. And what we've done is to exercise our rights under that statute and under the Constitution. And we've presented the evidence, we think, in an understandable way, primarily intended to be read by the grand jury, but also the U.S. Attorney. And we're simply asking the U.S. Attorney to do their job under that federal statute and to hand this package of evidence to a grand jury and ask them first to confirm what we have already confirmed, which is that a crime, in fact, was committed, the crime of bombing of a public place in a terrorist act, and that is the underlying federal criminal statute that we're focused on. And we're focused, of course, on the evidence that the World Trade Center buildings 1, 2, and 7 were brought down by use of explosives on 9/11. The point of this petition is that the reason the buildings fell, not the reason they caught on fire, but the reason that they fell, is that explosives were used, and you really have to get into the details, which we can summarize for you, to understand, and of course architects and engineers understand this well. There's a body of scientific evidence that supports this conclusion. I think most of us in this effort to bring this truth out would rather the truth be something different. I don't think any of us are excited about the prospect of someone having planned to essentially murder 2,000 people by bringing these buildings down while these innocent people were in the buildings. So it's a horrible crime. We'd rather not believe it, but we are compelled by the evidence to reach that conclusion.
How does it work? So you filed this. What is the next step in the process, and then what follows after that?
Well, if you don't mind, and if Julio doesn't mind, I'm going to defer to my colleague, Julio Gomez, to see if he wants to start that answer, and then maybe I can add a note at the end.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, it's very simple. Federal Code 18 U.S.C. 3332A is a federal law that anyone can look up. It is precisely the federal mechanism under which we are proceeding. It allows a public citizen to present or bring evidence of a federal crime to a prosecutor, and it obligates a federal prosecutor to bring that to the attention of the grand jury. So what we would expect to happen in this particular instance is that the U.S. Attorney's Office would assign this matter to an assistant U.S. attorney, and then that assistant U.S. attorney would go to an impaneled grand jury. The federal system has grand juries impaneled all the time to consider prosecutions and indictments under the federal laws, and then to present this evidence to that federal grand jury. That grand jury, upon the presentation of this information, then has a variety of mechanisms at its disposal to follow up on any of the information that is presented to it. So to give you an example, a grand jury would have subpoena power. It could subpoena any individuals that are or entities that are referenced in the evidentiary materials. For example, it could subpoena the experts who have presented their findings, which are part of the evidence. It could interview those persons under oath. It could compel the appearance of other witnesses, perhaps persons who were there. We cite numerous testimonies from firefighters and first responders. The grand jury would be authorized to compel their attendance and to take their testimony under oath. The grand jury could even go further. It could make insinuations about some of the evidence and draw inferences therefrom and subpoena other persons who may also possess information. Information about access to the buildings, information about security protocols. So the grand jury is really poised to investigate or take this information and evidence to the next level and create a record. And then, based on its investigation, it would be authorized to recommend an indictment of one or more persons, either based on the information that we've presented, the use of explosives, or based on other federal laws that it may think had been violated or broken and found to be broken during the investigation. That would be followed by the federal prosecutor's decision to entertain the indictment. And if that were to go forward, then we might have an indictment of someone else we don't yet know about. The proceedings are secret. There is a possibility, although we are not we're not optimistic that we would be called upon, could be called upon to present ourselves the evidence to the grand jury. That is rare. But that is what we are anticipating could happen. Now, look, we are very realistic about this. The federal prosecutor, the U.S. Attorney's Office, may decide that this is not worth presenting to a grand jury. That would be a violation of the law, in our view, since they're obligated to present. But there is a precedent that shows that in some instances, the U.S. Attorney's Office will decide it won't present. And if that is the case, then there is a mechanism by which we would be authorized to go to court and ask a judge to compel the U.S. Attorney's Office to present this information. That's getting ahead of ourselves, but it is part of the procedure that is in place, and that's supported by precedent that we have studied and reviewed.
Now, Julio, to clarify, who makes up a grand jury, and does the prosecutor have to follow their recommendations?
Grand jury is made up of public citizens. Basically, just like a petit jury, a jury that would sit on a criminal trial, for example, grand juries are drawn from a variety of public sources, voter rolls, driver's licenses, etc., and they would be made up of anywhere from 16 to 23 citizens in the Southern District of New York. So they're selected at random. No, the prosecutor is not obligated to follow their recommendations.
But it would look pretty bad if they didn't. And I know you said that you're being realistic, and yes, we always got to be grounded. But what I respect is the fact that you are going through the process. I mean, sometimes things need to be done that are not easy, but they still have to be done. Just like if, you're in a war and you have to take a certain storm the beach or whatever to overcome the enemy, and there's no other way to get around, you're going to have to do it, no matter how difficult it is. So that's what you guys are doing. That's what we do at AE 9/11 Truth many times. So that is really good. Now, I know that over the years I've been around a lot of truth groups, and people throw out ideas. They'll say, we should sue George Bush for this or that. We should sue NIST for faulty building reports. To my knowledge, none of these things have been done. I think there was even one guy that wanted to get involved in the Larry Silverstein lawsuit with the insurance companies. But now you guys are choosing this route, and I want to hear, we're going to begin with Julio, but I want to hear from Dave and Mick also your thoughts on why this route and why now.
Well, this route, Andy, is primarily because what we're trying to do is really create a record. We're trying to bring this information in a legal proceeding. This one was available to us. It is also a proceeding where we are allowed to publicize the information as we have done, make it available to the public. It's something that's easy for the public to follow. And at the end of the day, what we want is in a body that sort of can carry the ball. A grand jury, like I said, would be able to issue subpoenas and take the investigation to the next level. And that's very attractive to us, particularly a small nonprofit that doesn't have any resources. We can't put investigators on our payroll. We don't have money to hire experts and conduct all kinds of investigations. Everyone, as I understand it, who has investigated this is basically doing it as a volunteer. And this particular legal mechanism allows for the government to use its resources with the assistance of, residents of the city of New York to pursue and unearth and, make the truth transparent. You had mentioned earlier in our conversation that debunkers don't get the facts right. And I think what people forget is that none of these facts have ever been proven in a court of law. So no one has ever presented evidence to a jury to decide how those buildings came down. No one has ever had to present that evidence. It's never been proven in a court of law. So the official story has never really been tested by our judicial system. And this is one initial step to get that test started.
Exactly. And the debunkers I talk about don't even know the official story they're defending. But that's the problem that we face, because it's such a technical issue in some respects. I mean, once you understand it, it becomes common sense. You can break it down into things, into circumstances that people would understand, comparing it to. But initially, people saw those airplanes hit those buildings, and they were so shocked and awed that they were willing to believe whatever the government told them, and they just moved on. They just assumed, airplanes hit 2 buildings and 3 of them fell down, and whatever. I think football's on next week. So, and that's a very good point. This evidence, our evidence, the government's supposed evidence, has never really gone before a jury to determine which canon of evidence is more strong. So I think this is another reason why this is such a good step, because we are going to be submitting this information to a grand jury, and that is, another level of outreach and trying to get this issue settled. Dave, I want you to comment on that. Why this route and why now?
Right. Well, New York is the most obvious because it has actually the most evidence gathered. The architects and engineers which got involved with the high-rise steel presented an analysis which is very compelling that explosions and controlled demolitions were involved, and they have produced the evidence that supports that conclusion. The firemen who were in the buildings, numerous, 118, talk about explosions, bombs going off out of, I believe, 155 first responders in total said that too. New York has, because of the concentration of energies here to try to figure out what happened, the evidence is accumulated here. So it makes it really easy for the attorneys to come into a scene where so many people have done so much. And yet, as Julio says, it hasn't been translated in a form of a actual jury or actual trial. And the true story hasn't really been told to the people. Now, there are other important areas, Shanksville, but, not many people know much about Shanksville. There's no high rise there to try to evaluate the evidence. So the evidence has not been gathered there, not to say it's not there. It just hasn't been the concentration of effort. The Pentagon, the same way. There's more evidence there that the official story is not the accurate story. But yet, still that and has to be done. I mean, it has to be probed. But New York City is the one that was sensational. So as far as an attorney or anyone trying to get a handle on this whole sensational crime, which encompassed a number of areas, a number of crime scenes, New York seems to be the most plausible. So the evidence there is, like I said, has been accumulating over years. So what the lawyers have done is to put it in a legal format and take it now into court, where it should have been, many years ago. The 9/11 investigation done by the commission that Tom Kane was involved with, it didn't really do what it should have done, in my opinion, and I'm sure probably in most people's opinion, that they fell short of presenting any kind of evidence. And in fact, I mentioned the firemen; they didn't even include them in their report, if you can believe that. All right, none of this science was included in the report. The dust samples that were found with the red-gray chips that Stephen Jones and Nels Harris were involved in, none of that was involved in the report. The laws of physics weren't involved in their report with regard to the molten steel and the collapse and the free fall, etc. And none of it was involved. So what we're doing is we're taking all these very powerful and sound scientific points and putting them into a document and giving it to the prosecutor to give to the grand jury, but yet making it available now on our website where people can go and look at the evidence and make their own decision. And I would believe that most people, when they look at that evidence, they're going to say, "Oh my God, oh my goodness, how did we miss this? And what's this government doing?" So I think that to answer your question, New York City is where a lot of the evidence is, and it makes it a little easier for the attorneys to assemble it and then present it in the way it was presented.
That's right. New York City is certainly our area of focus with the World Trade Center, and you mentioned the 9/11 Commission. I think everybody in this audience, who's mostly 9/11 truthers, will agree that was just a presentation, a show for the American public, a way to say that we did something when they really didn't do anything, and provide a shield for politicians to say, well, there was a 9/11 Commission, when they get asked about Building 7 and the free fall and the nanothermite in the dust. So, we need to have a real investigation, as we say every week here. Mick, I'm going to ask you the same question. Why this route? Why now?
Well, the immediate answer is that it's the route that the law provides for dealing with this type of problem. It should have been done, 15, 16, 17 years ago. And what I mean by that is, in this country, under the Constitution, no one can be indicted for a felony and prosecuted for a felony absent an indictment proposed by a grand jury and signed by the U.S. Attorney. So with this, as David described, is very compelling evidence that architects and engineers and other independent scientists have developed, like Stephen Jones, Kevin Rines, and Niels Harris, go down the list, that, we, as a group of lawyers, looking at that evidence, have concluded that it satisfies the legal standard, not just for presenting to a grand jury, which is a fairly low legal standard. Actually, the grand jury could even consider hearsay. It's not like you need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the crime to get it in front of a grand jury. That's the prosecutor's job later. The grand jury's job is simply to investigate and determine whether a crime was committed and then who committed it and whether there's a basis for an indictment. So the government has chosen, for reasons which are not clear, to ignore this evidence for 17 years, and so our grand jury has never seen it. So our approach has been to do the obvious step, which is to do what the government should have done and hasn't done, and compile this evidence and use the federal statute that Julio described to force the Department of Justice to hand this evidence to a grand jury. The idea, of course, is that everyday citizens looking at this body of evidence are likely to have the same reaction that we all did when we finally had a chance to study it, and that by that mechanism we may see at least the beginning of some judicial action and accountability on this. There'll still be the need for the DOJ to do its job at some point, which we hope that they do if the grand jury, drafts an indictment. So it's the obvious legal mechanism for this type of crime. You can't really get prosecution without a grand jury indictment. So that's the short answer. There's another answer that Julio touched on. That is that, we don't have the resources of the government to investigate and prosecute these crimes. We're a group of citizens. A lot of us happen to be lawyers, but that doesn't mean we have resources, particularly those of us who are public interest lawyers. The resource we bring to bear is our training and the commitment of our time, but we don't have the ability to subpoena witnesses, friendly or hostile. We don't have the ability to, offer a witness immunity, which the grand jury could do to get their testimony. We don't have the ability to offer a plea deal to one suspect in order to get evidence against another, which the Department of Justice can do, working with the grand jury. So there are, in addition, various strategic reasons why this issue should be put in the hands of the entities with the power to really bring the truth out. Of course, they'll need the inclination to bring the truth out. But, I'm optimistic that the everyday citizens on the grand jury will have that inclination. I'm cautiously optimistic, which means less optimistic, that the Department of Justice will act on the grand jury's recommendation, but they may well, and of course they should. And I just want to note one other distinction. There's a special grand jury provided for by federal statute, and that's one of the statutes we're referencing that we're using to get our evidence in front of a grand jury. It actually goes to a special grand jury. The reason I mentioned the distinction between a special grand jury and a routine grand jury is that the special grand jury has the power to issue a report, even if no indictment comes from their work, or even if they propose an indictment and the U.S. attorney simply refuses to sign it. The grand jury can nonetheless issue a written report if it's a special grand jury. And I'm not sure about the regular grand jury, but I know the special grand jury can do this. And the report can summarize, report what they found as a grand jury in investigating the potential crimes. And if the grand jury finds, in the course of their inquiry, evidence of government misconduct, malfeasance, misfeasance, nonfeasance by government officials, that can be included in the special grand jury report as well. And the report is given to a federal judge who reviews it, and if it meets federal standards and doesn't trigger some secrecy requirement, and normally it would not, that report gets published for all of us to read. So that's an additional reason why we feel it's important to put this evidence in front of a special grand jury at the moment.
I'm so heartened by the fact that this process exists. It shows how noble our legal system is intended to be, and with good people at the helm, we can really make good use of it. We just got to have good people in those positions of power. And, by talking about this continuously and doing things like what you are doing, we undermine confidence in the official story, which undermines confidence in our officials that don't act on the evidence and doing something about it. So we're doing a lot of good through our actions and, through your work as well. So, Mick, I'm going to ask you, but I'm going to ask Julio and Dave also to chime in. Anything is being left out, but you cited evidence. What is some of the key evidence that you cited when you filed this petition?
Well, we probably each have a different answer as to why this is the most striking piece of evidence, because there is an abundance of evidence in this case. If you're looking at this from a scientific perspective, I think the finding of the red-gray chips with active thermitic material, Dave mentioned, which is something that Kevin Ryan and Niels Harrod and their colleagues did in their research, which was published in a peer-reviewed journal. And what that means is, to a layperson, that explosive material was found, residue of explosive material in the dust of the World Trade Center, just as it has been found at other bombing crimes that have been acknowledged by the FBI. And that's a huge piece of evidence. It's hard to explain it any other way. And continuing from a scientific perspective, you got this free fall for Building 7 that happened for 2-some seconds of the collapse. And, scientists can understand that free fall, which is acceleration at the rate of gravity, just cannot happen. It cannot happen with a building that has not been artificially broken apart by the use of explosives, because as the building collapses from the top down, the floors above encounter resistance from the intact floors below. And that either stops the collapse or it, at a minimum, slows it down. And so you cannot have acceleration at the rate of gravity unless the resistance of those lower floors are removed by use of explosives that are well timed, and that's how buildings are commercially demolished. So that piece of evidence is also, to me, convincing, and there's no really other way to explain it. And there are other significant pieces of evidence as well, like the sulfidation of the steel, which requires a lot of sulfur, and thermite or thermate, to be precise, would have to be present to do that. Extreme temperatures, another scientific point. You can't get these extreme temperatures much higher than the jet fuel burns at without some unusual source, such as thermite, which is designed to create these extreme temperatures. That's how it works. It cuts through steel is through this extreme temperature that it melts right through steel. So, as I'm fond of quoting in my other presentations, if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains must be the truth, however improbable it is. I think that's the situation we're in here. The science tells us that there is no other explanation for these building collapses other than the use of explosives. We may not want to believe it. We certainly don't like it. But everything else has been eliminated scientifically. So what remains, which is a difficult reality, has to be the truth.
That's right. I think the first time I heard that quote was from Sherlock Holmes. I don't know who originally said it in history, but it's true. Is if you remove what can't possibly happen from the equation, then whatever's left, even if you don't want to believe it, is what the truth is. And that's just the way it is. And that's why we've been at this for so long, because we've had the corporate media assisting our government and turning a blind eye to this evidence. And in my view, in the greater world and what's going on in this country, I think we're worse off for it. You let a bully get away with one thing, then they're just going to keep on pushing. You keep redrawing that line, you eventually find yourself backed in a corner. That's why this is so important to me. David, I want to ask you this one. How important has the role of the victims' family members been in all this?
Well, the main victim's family member that I know is Bob McIlvaine. And he's a stalwart. He's a wonderful person, wonderful human being. And he lost his son, Bobby, as Bobby was, he's pieced it together, and he believes that Bobby was killed as he was walking into the North Tower. And he was just going to, that's Building 1. And he was just going through there. He was going to go through to the other side because he had a meeting. It wasn't in that building. And his body was one of the few bodies that was really recovered, or at least partially intact. And Bob has been to the hearings at the beginning, and he's stayed the course the entire time. And it's not unusual, and it'll probably will happen if you see Bob talk, and when he gets into the issue, he'll break down crying. And that's out of the great love that he has for his son. And he has this anger, he says. He justifies it. He says, it keeps me going because as other people have, they've sort of not dropped off, but they're not active like he is. So when the other day when we had the press conference and when the petition was filed, it was Bob McIlvaine that was with us when we did that. So he sort of represents to me the consummate love and need to go forward with this as far as a parent caring about his son or his daughter that was killed or any relative. And it's very special when you see him and when you deal with him. So I can't talk about the other victims, family members, etc. like that. I met some, but I don't know them like Bob. But to me, Bob is the symbol of the endurance and the ability to stay the course. He's stayed the course for the entire time. It's very difficult.
Now, I want to hear from each of you about this. This is not really a legal question or about the grand jury petition, but I like to know what motivates people, what keeps them going in this movement for this issue that so many people have turned a blind eye from in our society. You guys are still at it and still working to get justice. So we're going to start with Julio. What keeps you going, and also why, in your view, can't this issue simply be swept aside? Why is it still important today?
Well, what keeps me going, Andy, is the search for truth, right? I mean, we can't, as citizens, really understand and participate in the world in which we live without knowing what is going on. And, everybody is involved in their daily routine. Everybody works. Everybody has a family. You carve out some time for relaxation, and you start the day anew every morning. And you sort of depend on a whole host of mechanisms in our society to assist you in your role as a citizen. And that's government. And the problem here is that government has failed to answer some very fundamental questions about what happened that day. To give you a very specific example, the 9/11 Commission, which was supposed to be the end-all, be-all of assessing what happened and holding people to account and changing the way we do things in the future, never at all mentions World Trade Center 7. Now, I don't understand how you can possibly come to any conclusions about what happened that day without wrestling with the fact that a third skyscraper fell that wasn't hit by a plane and barely had any fires reportedly in it. That's what keeps me going, is the idea that I can't, as a citizen, function in this society, which I was raised to believe was the United States of America, founded on all of the values that the founding fathers cherished, and yet not have all of these questions answered. I can't hold anyone accountable or decide if the right people are being held accountable unless I understand fully the facts of that day. And so you can't move forward. You can't develop policy that is reasonable. You can't make decisions that are reasonable. I mean, there have been enormous consequences as a result of 9/11. We're involved in 2 wars we can't seem to end. There's a surveillance apparatus that's been installed since 9/11. There, is a drone program. We have suspended habeas corpus, which is, enshrined in our Constitution. All of these things had happened, and yet we still don't know exactly why. And so that's why it's so important, and that's why I think this is lasting so long, because people are completely unsettled. And without finally creating a record and proving what happened that day, it's hard to get past it.
I can't agree with you more, and that is such a good point to raise, is the lack of trust that arises when you see such clear injustice in front of you. It's like if you've got a family in a house and you might want to spend your Sunday morning making omelets with the wife and kids and doing family stuff, but it becomes harder to do that if you've got a big hole in the roof and the snow is falling on you and you're standing in your coats and freezing your butts off. So you got to deal with the hole in the roof before you go ahead and do all the fun family things. And I think about our country. I mean, it's so nice to be able to sit down on a Sunday and watch football and worry about, this TV show or that. But when you've got the institutions that are supposed to be overseeing the protection of our people and also, be investigating matters like September 11th, and they're so obviously not just dropping the ball, but complicit in a cover-up of what really happened, you can't focus on all of these things. And people lose trust in government, and it's happened over time. And it's not because of what we're doing, other than the fact that we're illuminating people about the truth of what happened, which is the right thing to do. And the fact that they keep on turning away from us, these people in these institutions, I think this represents a huge national security threat. It's a slow one, and I've seen it befall other countries. I've seen the aftermath of this in other countries, and it's not a road we want to go down. Dave, I'm going to ask you, what keeps you going, and why is 9/11 still important today?
Right. Well, you both hit on it, Julio did, and yourself. I say not on my watch. I've, as a young person, I've lived through the Kennedy times and Martin Luther King times, and we lived through Oklahoma bombing times, and I've looked into those crimes, and I say not on my watch. I've got 3 children. Hopefully I'll have some grandchildren someday. Since 9/11, we've seen the Constitution be shredded totally. We've seen the National Defense Authorization Act has to do with indefinite detention, the Patriot Act. We have surveillance 24/7 now. Your emails are gathered. Your telephone calls are gathered. Your messages. We have drone warfare where we can kill someone and not be accountable for it. We have wars that are undeclared and where we're killing millions of people. The United States citizens are killing millions of people, and they don't even know it, as you said, watching your football game or whatever and relaxing. So the bottom line for me is truth and justice, accountability in government, and there is a lack of trust in the government, and deservingly so, and we hope that this grand jury petition in its own little way changes the energy and the momentum. It's like we're taking it to them in a way. It's empowering. When you read that document, it's empowering. It will open the eyes of many people, and hopefully they'll get active in some way so they can reverse this situation, because we are heading to a police state or to a fascist state. That's what we're talking about. We don't have to use that word, but because the corporations now are citizens, they've become bigger and bigger and more powerful. The news agencies have deserted us. They're not doing what Thomas Jefferson said as far as the fourth estate, and the citizens have not educated themselves, and they're not vigilant. So hopefully we can reverse it, do our little bit here, and it's almost like we are an army now. It's almost like we're defending what? We're defending our identity as Americans. We're defending what we talk about as freedom and democracy, and we have to get to the truth of the matter. And once we get to the truth of the matter, hopefully through investigations like the grand jury investigation and to this site and other sites, then we get to the justice of the matter, and we reverse this and reverse the direction. So it's a matter of energy, and now we've been taking it and taking it and taking it. Now we're pushing back, a little bit pushing back, and the reactions we're starting to get, at least a little reaction, very, very, very positive. So I'm excited by that. And as you've sort of been down in the dumps and in the valley, now we're starting to emerge from it, and I think you'll see more and more energy being put into rectifying the situation and getting the country back to what we believe it should be, as that pillar of freedom and an example for the rest of the world, a good neighbor for the rest of the world. Thanks, Andy.
Absolutely, and it's got to drive them nuts that we're still at this, that we haven't taken our ball and gone home. Mick, why is 9/11 still important, and what keeps you going?
Well, that's a multi-part answer. I'll give you the short version. It overlaps with what my colleagues have said very eloquently. The first is, as a lawyer, I took an oath to defend the Constitution, and I didn't sign that casually. So I take it seriously, and what we're looking at here is a crime on a scale that does threaten the Constitution. Julio's touched on some of the reasons it does, but the fact that our government hasn't investigated and prosecuted this crime suggests that our government has been compromised in some way. We're still investigating, as the Lawyers Committee, the ins and outs of the government misconduct issue, and you may see another report or another petition in that area before too long. But the short version is, I think all of us as attorneys who've taken this oath need to look at this issue and see what we can do to defend and protect the Constitution. And I think Dave is right that we are, and Julio, that we are living at a time when the Constitution is threatened, and the events of 9/11 are a prime example of that threat. From a personal point of view, the most motivating thing for me is to get justice and truth for the family members. I think they deserve that, and that's, from an emotional point of view, the strongest motive for me. Also, I started out as a public interest lawyer, and even before then as a consumer advocate, believing in the concept that Ralph Nader has put out of what he calls a public citizen. And I think we all have to act as public citizens in a real democracy in order to preserve it. And, with knowledge, I believe, comes responsibility to act. And those of us in the legal profession and like those in the scientific professions, we have specialized knowledge, and we can understand more quickly what really happened based on a look at this evidence. And we aren't as susceptible to the propaganda that comes sometimes from the media, sometimes from the government, sometimes from private sources to mislead on what has happened in situations like this. So those of us who understand it more quickly, because of our training, have a duty, I think, to help everyone else understand it. So I think that public citizen concept is one of my motivators. And, Dave touched on Thomas Jefferson. It might have actually been another one of our founding fathers who said, we need to maintain eternal vigilance to preserve democracy. A number of folks have said it may have come from Europe, but it's true. And, we all need to do our part, or we're not going to have a democracy. So it's strange. You'll probably find it strange for me to use this particular phrase, but, I think that we do need to make America great again, and not necessarily in the same way that other folks have been talking about it, but, America has been sort of the beacon of hope for a lot of people. And it's because we haven't maintained a perfect democracy, but we have maintained a real democracy. And I think we owe it not just to ourselves, but to the world to continue to set that example.
And those are words to end it on. We are certainly going to keep track of the developments regarding this petition filed with the grand jury. We actually linked to the PDF in the bulletin. Thank you so much for what you're doing, and thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall. This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week. Good luck.